The winter wind cut through downtown Denver like a blade, carrying the promise of another brutal storm. Jack Morrison pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his chest as he walked through the empty streets. The pain that had been his constant companion for 3 months now stabbed at him with each breath, a reminder of the accident that had changed everything. At 52, Jack had spent most of his adult life working cattle ranches across Colorado. His weathered hands and sun-beaten face told stories of countless days under the open sky, but those days were behind him now. The doctors had been clear about his condition. His lungs would never fully recover from the pneumonia that followed his fall from a spooked horse. The infection had spread, leaving scar tissue that made every breath a struggle. Tonight, like many nights recently, sleep had eluded him. The small apartment he rented above Murphy's hardware store felt more like a prison than a home. The walls seemed to close in when the pain flared up, making him feel trapped and restless. Walking helped sometimes, even in the bitter cold of a February night. As Jack turned the corner onto Maple Street, he noticed something unusual near the old playground. The street light cast a pale circle of light over the frozen park, illuminating the swing sets and monkey bars that stood like lonely sentinels in the snow. But there on one of the benches was a small figure that didn't belong in this desolate scene. Jack's breath caught in his throat, sending a sharp pain through his damaged lungs. He squinted through the falling snow, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as he moved closer, the reality became undeniable. A young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, sat motionless on the bench. Her small body was curled into itself, and even from a distance, Jack could see she was wearing nothing but a thin nightgown and slippers. The sight jolted him into action despite the protest from his lungs. Jack hurried across the street, his boots crunching through the snow that had accumulated on the sidewalk. With each step, more details became clear, and each one filled him with growing alarm. The girl's lips had taken on a blue tint that Jack recognized from his years working outdoors. Her dark hair was matted with snow and ice, and her small hands were tucked under her arms in a desperate attempt to find warmth. She was conscious, but barely responsive, her eyes staring blankly ahead as if she had retreated somewhere deep inside herself to escape the cold. Jack knelt down in front of the bench, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through his chest. His voice came out rough and gentle at the same time, like gravel wrapped in velvet. The girl didn't respond to his first attempts to get her attention. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and Jack could see the telltale signs of hypothermia setting in. Without hesitation, Jack shrugged out of his heavy jacket and wrapped it around the girl's tiny frame. The cold hit him immediately, but his concern for her overrode his own discomfort. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, like a bird with hollow bones. The girl stirred slightly as the warmth from his jacket began to penetrate her frozen body. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing the deepest brown eyes Jack had ever seen. They held a mixture of fear and resignation that no child should ever possess. She tried to speak, but only a soft whimper escaped her lips. Jack's mind raced as he considered his options. The nearest hospital was 15 minutes away by car, but he didn't own a vehicle. His apartment was only 3 blocks away, and he had a space heater that could provide immediate warmth. The decision made itself as another gust of wind howled through the park, carrying with it the promise of an even more severe storm. The walk back to his apartment felt like the longest journey of Jack's life. Each step was carefully measured to avoid slipping on the icy sidewalk while protecting the precious cargo in his arms. The girl had stopped shivering, which Jack knew was actually a bad sign. Her body was shutting down, conserving what little heat remained for her vital organs. As they walked, Jack found himself talking to her in low, soothing tones. He told her about the ranch where he used to work, describing the horses and cattle as if they were old friends. He talked about summer days when the prairie stretched endlessly under a bright blue sky, and the way the mountains looked when they were painted purple by the setting sun. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but He hoped his voice might provide some small comfort. The stairs to his apartment had never seemed so steep. Jack's lungs burned with the effort of climbing while carrying the girl, but he pushed through the pain. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and step into the relative warmth of his modest home. Jack immediately cranked up the space heater and positioned it near his old recliner. He gently placed the girl in the chair and began the careful process of warming her up. He knew from his ranch experience that warming someone with hypothermia had to be done gradually. Too much heat too fast could be dangerous, potentially causing more harm than good. He made his way to the kitchen and put water on to boil for hot chocolate. While the water heated, he gathered every blanket he owned, creating a cocoon of warmth around the girl. Her color was slowly beginning to improve, though she remained largely unresponsive. As Jack worked, he couldn't help but wonder about her story. How had such a young child ended up alone in a park in the middle of a winter night? Where were her parents? The nightgown she wore suggested she had come from somewhere nearby, but Jack couldn't think of any residential areas within walking distance of the park. The water began to whistle, pulling Jack from his thoughts. He prepared a cup of hot chocolate, making it warm but not hot enough to burn. When he returned to the living room, he found the girl's eyes open and watching him with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Jack moved slowly and spoke in gentle tones as he approached her. He introduced himself and explained that she was safe now. The girl accepted small sips of the hot chocolate, and with each swallow, a bit more life seemed to return to her small frame. As the warmth began to penetrate her body, the girl started to respond more actively. She still hadn't spoken, but she was tracking Jack's movements with her eyes and had begun to show signs of awareness of her surroundings. Jack noticed she flinched whenever he moved too quickly, suggesting she had learned to be afraid of sudden movements. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows of the small apartment. Jack realized that even if he wanted to take the girl somewhere else, the weather would make it dangerous to venture out again. They would need to wait until morning, or at least until the storm passed. As the night wore on, Jack found himself studying the girl's face in the soft light of the space heater. Despite her obvious ordeal, there was something resilient about her, a strength that seemed to shine through her exhaustion. Her dark hair had dried into soft curls that framed a heart-shaped face marked by experiences no child should have to endure. Gradually, the girl's natural body heat began to return. The blue tint left her lips, and her breathing became more regular. Jack continued to monitor her carefully, offering small amounts of warm liquid and adjusting her blankets as needed. He found himself drawing on knowledge from his ranch days, when he had occasionally needed to treat animals suffering from exposure to the elements. As dawn approached, Jack realized he would need to make some decisions about the girl's immediate future. She would need proper medical attention, and authorities would need to be contacted to find her family. But for now, she was safe and warm, and that was enough. The girl had drifted into what appeared to be natural sleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Jack settled into a chair nearby, keeping watch over her as the storm continued to rage outside. His own pain seemed less important now, overshadowed by his concern for this mysterious child who had entered his life in such dramatic circumstances. The first light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across the small apartment. Jack realized that in the space of a few hours, his solitary existence had been completely transformed. He was no longer alone with his pain and his memories of better days. Instead, he had become a protector, a guardian for someone even more vulnerable than himself. As he watched the girl sleep, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. The pain in his chest was still there, stabbing at him with each breath, but it no longer seemed like the most important thing in his world. This small, brave girl had somehow given him a reason to push through his own suffering. The storm showed no signs of letting up, which meant they would likely be spending at least another day together in the small apartment. Jack began to plan how he would care for her, thinking about what food he had available and how he could make her more comfortable. He realized he didn't even know her name yet, but somehow that didn't seem important right now. What mattered was that she was alive and safe, wrapped in warmth, and beginning to recover from her ordeal. Jack settled back in his chair, prepared to maintain his vigil for as long as necessary. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall, but inside the small apartment, two damaged souls had found each other in their time of greatest need. The awakening the morning light brought with it a new awareness for both Jack and the girl. As she slowly emerged from her exhausted sleep, Jack could see intelligence and alertness returning to her dark eyes. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing was strong and steady. The immediate crisis had passed, but Jack knew their journey together was just beginning. The girl sat up carefully in the recliner, pulling the blankets around herself like a protective barrier. She looked around the modest apartment with curious eyes, taking in the simple furniture, the photographs of horses and ranch life that decorated the walls, and, most importantly, the weathered cowboy who had saved her life. Jack had prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, along with another cup of hot chocolate. He approached slowly, setting the plate on a small table within her reach. The girl watched his movements carefully, still wary, but no longer showing the acute fear she had displayed the night before. When Jack spoke, his voice was gentle and patient. He told her his name again and explained where she was. He asked if she was hurt anywhere, if she needed anything for pain, and, most importantly, he asked her name. For a long moment, the girl simply stared at him, as if weighing whether she could trust him with such personal information. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke her first word to him. Emma. Her name was Emma, and she was 8 years old. The words came slowly at first, like water trickling through a dam, but once she started talking, more details began to emerge. Emma's story unfolded gradually over the next few hours. She had been living with her stepfather since her mother died 6 months earlier. The man, whose name was Dale, had started drinking heavily after losing his job at the factory. What had begun as neglect had gradually escalated into something much worse. Jack listened without judgment as Emma described the fear that had become her constant companion. She talked about hiding in her bedroom when Dale brought friends over, about going to bed hungry because there was no food in the house, and about the bruises she had learned to hide under long sleeves and careful positioning. The night before, something had changed. Dale had been drinking more than usual, and his mood had turned especially dark. Emma had tried to stay out of his way, but when she accidentally knocked over a glass while getting a drink of water, his rage had exploded. The details were hard for her to share, and Jack didn't push for more than she was willing to tell. What was clear was that Emma had reached a breaking point. In the middle of the night, while Dale was passed out on the couch, she had made the desperate decision to leave. She had no plan, no destination in mind. She had simply walked out into the storm, driven by a survival instinct that told her staying was more dangerous than facing the winter night alone. As Emma shared her story, Jack felt his own pain transforming into something else entirely. The physical ache in his chest was still there, but it was joined by a different kind of pain, the heartbreak of hearing about a child suffering and the rage that came with knowing someone had hurt her. Jack had never been married, never had children of his own. His life had been spent with horses and cattle, under open skies and on endless ranges. But something about Emma's courage and resilience spoke to him in a way he had never experienced before. She reminded him of the young colts he used to work with, initially skittish and afraid, but with an underlying strength that just needed the right encouragement to flourish. By midday, the storm had finally begun to ease. Jack knew he needed to contact the authorities, but he was torn about what that would mean for Emma. The system that was supposed to protect children had already failed her once. How could he be sure it wouldn't fail her again? Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle. As they sat together eating lunch, she asked him directly what was going to happen to her. Jack was honest in his response. He explained that they would need to contact Child Protective Services and that Emma would likely be placed in foster care while they investigated her situation. The fear that flashed across Emma's face at this news broke Jack's heart. She had already run away once to escape an impossible situation. The thought of being placed back into an uncertain environment clearly terrified her. Jack found himself making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He told Emma he would do everything in his power to make sure she was placed somewhere safe, somewhere she would be cared for properly. That afternoon, Jack made the necessary phone calls. He contacted Child Protective Services first, explaining the situation and requesting that a social worker come to his apartment rather than requiring Emma to go to an office. He also called the local police to report finding Emma and to give them information about her stepfather. While they waited for the authorities to arrive, Jack and Emma spent time getting to know each other better. Jack showed her his photo albums from his ranch days, pointing out his favorite horses and sharing stories about life in the countryside. Emma was particularly fascinated by the pictures of foals and calves, asking detailed questions about how they were cared for. In return, Emma shared more about her life before the tragedy that had claimed her mother. She had been a good student who loved to read, especially stories about animals and adventures. She talked about her mother with a mixture of love and profound sadness, describing a woman who had worked 2 jobs to support them and who had always made Emma feel safe and loved. As the afternoon progressed, Jack began to form an idea that seemed both crazy and perfectly logical at the same time. He had been drifting since his injury, living day to day without real purpose or direction. Emma needed someone who would fight for her, someone who would ensure she never again found herself alone and vulnerable in the world. When the social worker arrived, Jack was relieved to find that she seemed genuinely caring and professional. Sarah Martinez had been working with children for over 15 years, and she had the kind of calm, reassuring presence that put both Jack and Emma at ease. She conducted a thorough but gentle interview with Emma, documenting her experiences and gathering the information needed to proceed with the case. During their conversation, Sarah explained the process that would unfold over the coming days and weeks. Emma's stepfather would be arrested and charged, and Emma would need to be placed in temporary care while the court proceedings moved forward. Sarah mentioned that finding appropriate placements was always challenging, especially for children who had experienced trauma. That was when Jack surprised everyone, including himself, by speaking up. He asked Sarah about the possibility of him serving as Emma's temporary guardian. He explained his background, his current situation, and his desire to provide Emma with a safe and stable environment while she recovered from her ordeal. Sarah's initial response was cautious, but not dismissive. She explained the requirements for emergency foster placement, including background checks, home studies, and training requirements. The process could take weeks or even months under normal circumstances, but given the urgent nature of Emma's situation, some accommodations might be possible. Emma's reaction to Jack's offer was immediate and heartfelt. For the first time since he had found her, she showed genuine emotion, tears streaming down her face as she nodded her approval. She moved closer to Jack on the couch, and he found himself putting a protective arm around her shoulders. The next few hours were a whirlwind of phone calls and paperwork. Sarah worked with her supervisor to expedite the background check process, taking advantage of the fact that Jack had no criminal history and had been a respected member of the ranching community for decades. Character references from his former employers painted a picture of a man who was reliable, honest, and capable of taking on significant responsibilities. The home study would need to wait until the following day, but Sarah was able to arrange for Emma to stay with Jack overnight under emergency provisions. She would return the next morning with a colleague to conduct the formal assessment and to check on Emma's adjustment. As evening approached, Jack realized how dramatically his life had changed in the span of less than 24 hours. The pain in his chest was still there, still stabbing at him with each breath, but it no longer defined his existence. Instead of being consumed by his own limitations and losses, he found himself focused on Emma's needs and her future. Emma had been quiet since Sarah's departure, processing the events of the day and the possibilities that lay ahead. Jack could see her struggling with hope and fear, wanting to believe that things might finally get better, but afraid to trust too completely. As they prepared for their second night together, Jack did something he hadn't done since his accident. He began a plan for the future. If he was going to become Emma's guardian, even temporarily, he would need to make some changes. The small apartment would need to be child-proofed and made more comfortable for a young girl. He would need to learn about things like school enrollment, proper nutrition for a growing child, and how to help someone heal from trauma. But more than the practical concerns, Jack found himself thinking about the emotional responsibility he was taking on. Emma had been hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect her. She would need patience, consistency, and, above all, proof that there were adults in the world who could be trusted to keep their promises. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in his bed while he kept watch from the recliner, Jack made a commitment that went far beyond the formal arrangements they were putting in place. He promised himself and the sleeping girl that he would be the kind of guardian she deserved, someone who would fight for her, advocate for her, and provide her with the security she had been missing. The pain in Jack's chest seemed different that night, less sharp somehow. As he watched Emma's peaceful breathing, he realized that caring for her was giving him something he hadn't even known he was missing, a reason to take care of himself. If he was going to be responsible for her well-being, he would need to manage his own health better, to find ways to cope with his limitations that didn't involve simply enduring each day. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world covered in fresh snow that sparkled in streetlight. Inside the small apartment, two people who had found each other in their darkest moments were beginning to build something new together. A family born not of blood but of choice, necessity, and the simple human need for connection. As the night deepened, Jack allowed himself to imagine what their life together might look like. He pictured helping Emma with homework at the kitchen table, teaching her about responsibility through caring for plants or maybe even a pet, and watching her rediscover the joy and curiosity that trauma had temporarily buried. The future was uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But for the first time in months, Jack Morrison had hope. The cowboy who had thought his useful days were behind him had discovered that sometimes the most important work of a person's life begins when they least expect it. Hashtag the healing 3 months later, Jack Morrison stood in the kitchen of their new apartment, watching Emma carefully arrange wildflowers in a mason jar. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the dramatic changes in both of their lives since that frozen February night when their paths had first crossed. The larger apartment had been a necessity as their temporary arrangement had gradually become something more permanent. Sarah Martinez had worked diligently to fast-track Jack's certification as a foster parent, and the court proceedings against Emma's stepfather had moved forward without requiring Emma to testify, thanks to the physical evidence and statement from neighbors who had witnessed his behavior. Jack's own health had improved remarkably during these months. His doctor attributed the progress partly to his renewed sense of purpose and partly to the fact that caring for Emma required him to maintain a more structured lifestyle. The pain in his chest was still present, but it had become manageable through a combination of medication, breathing exercises, and the simple fact that he no longer spent his days focused on his limitations. Emma had blossomed in ways that amazed everyone who knew their story. The frightened, traumatized child who had barely spoken 3 months ago had transformed into a curious, engaged 8-year-old who filled their home with laughter and questions. Her natural intelligence had reasserted itself once she felt safe, and her teachers at the new school were impressed by her resilience and eagerness to learn. The nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by dreams of horses and adventures that she would eagerly share with Jack over breakfast. She had put on weight and grown taller, her face filling out and losing the gaunt look that had marked her during those first difficult weeks. Jack had discovered parenting skills he never knew he possessed. He had learned to braid hair through YouTube videos, had mastered the art of packing nutritious lunches that Emma would actually eat, and had become an expert at bedtime stories that featured brave girls and loyal horses. Most importantly, he had learned to read Emma's moods and needs, providing comfort during difficult moments and space when she needed to process her experiences independently. Their morning routine had become a cherished ritual. Emma would wake first, tiptoeing to the kitchen to start the coffee for Jack, and pour herself a glass of orange juice. Jack would emerge from his room to find her at the kitchen table, usually with a book open and her homework spread around her like a fortress of learning. This particular morning was special because it marked exactly 3 months since Emma had come to live with him. Jack had planned a small celebration, nothing elaborate that might overwhelm her, but enough to acknowledge how far they had both traveled since that night in the park. Emma had been unusually quiet during breakfast, and Jack sensed she had something on her mind. He had learned to wait for her to find her own words rather than pushing her to share before she was ready. As she finished her cereal, Emma looked up at him with the serious expression she wore when she was wrestling with important thoughts. She asked him directly if he was happy that she had come to live with him. The question caught Jack off guard, not because he was uncertain about the answer, but because he realized how much courage it had taken for her to ask. Behind her words, he could hear the deeper fear, the worry that she was a burden, that she had disrupted his life in ways he might secretly resent. Jack's response came from the heart. He told Emma that finding her that night had been the best thing that had happened to him in years. He explained how caring for her had given his life meaning and purpose that he hadn't realized he was missing. He shared how proud he was of her strength and resilience, how much joy she brought to his daily existence, and how grateful he was that they had found each other when they both needed it most. Emma's face lit up with relief and happiness. She confessed that she had been worried about being too much trouble, about taking up too much space in his life. Jack assured her that she belonged exactly where she was, that their home was her home for as long as she wanted it to be. The conversation led naturally to a discussion about the future. The legal proceedings were nearly complete, and soon they would need to make decisions about their long-term arrangements. Jack had already begun the process of applying to adopt Emma, but he wanted to make sure she understood what that meant and that it was what she truly wanted. Emma's response was immediate and enthusiastic. She had been hoping Jack would want to make their arrangement permanent, but she hadn't dared to ask. The idea of being officially adopted, of having Jack legally recognized as her father, felt like the final piece of security she needed to fully believe that she was safe and loved. That afternoon, they took a trip to the park where Jack had found Emma. It was her idea. She wanted to see the place where her new life had begun, but this time in daylight and warmth instead of darkness and cold. The park looked completely different in the spring sunshine, filled with families enjoying the mild weather and children playing on the same equipment that had stood silent witness to Emma's desperate night. As they sat on the bench where Jack had first seen her, Emma shared some of her memories from that night. She talked about how cold she had been, how scared, and how she had begun to think she might die alone in that park. But she also shared something else. She told Jack that even in her fear and confusion, she had somehow known he was safe when she first saw him approaching. Jack was moved by her trust, both then and now. He told Emma about his own experience that night, how finding her had pulled him out of his own darkness and given him something to fight for. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The visit to the park became a turning point in their relationship. From that day forward, Emma seemed to shed the last of her defensive walls. She began talking more freely about her mother and her memories from before the tragedy. She started making plans for the future, talking about what she wanted to be when she grew up, what subjects she wanted to study, and what kind of adventure she hoped to have. Jack found himself making plans too. He began researching opportunities for them to spend time on working ranches, knowing that Emma was fascinated by his stories of life with horses and cattle. He looked into programs that would allow him to share his knowledge with young people while giving Emma a chance to experience the outdoor life that had shaped his character. His health continued to improve as the weeks passed. The doctors were amazed by his progress, noting that his lung function had stabilized and even improved slightly. Jack credited Emma with saving his life in ways that went far beyond their initial encounter. She had given him reasons to take better care of himself, to seek treatment for his condition, and to believe that his future held possibilities he hadn't considered. Emma's school performance had become exceptional. Her teachers noted her maturity and resilience, but also her joy in learning and her eagerness to participate in classroom activities. She had made several close friends and had been invited to multiple birthday parties and sleepovers. Jack was careful to encourage these normal childhood experiences while maintaining the security that Emma needed to feel safe. The adoption paperwork moved forward steadily. Sarah Martinez remained their caseworker throughout the process, and she often remarked on the remarkable transformation she had witnessed in both Jack and Emma. What had begun as an emergency placement had evolved into one of the most successful matches she had seen in her career. As summer approached, Jack and Emma began planning their first vacation together. They decided on a trip to a dude ranch in Montana, where Emma could learn to ride horses and Jack could share his love of the outdoors with her. The trip would also serve as a celebration of their adoption, which was scheduled to be finalized just before they left. The night before the adoption hearing, Emma crawled into Jack's lap as they sat in their favorite spot on the couch. She thanked him for saving her life, but Jack corrected her gently. He told her that they had saved each other, that their meeting had been the kind of miracle that happens when two people who need each other find each other at exactly the right moment. Emma asked him what her new name would be after the adoption. Jack had assumed she would want to keep her mother's surname, but Emma surprised him by saying she wanted to take his name. She wanted to be Emma Morrison, to officially belong to the family they had created together. The adoption hearing was a joyful affair, attended by Sarah Martinez and several of Emma's new friends from school. The judge remarked on the obvious bond between Jack and Emma and praised them both for their courage in building a new life together. When he signed the final papers, Emma officially became Jack's daughter in the eyes of the law. That evening, they celebrated with dinner at Emma's favorite restaurant. As they sat across from each other, sharing dessert and laughing about the day's events, Jack marveled at how completely his life had changed. The pain in his chest had become merely a physical reminder of his past struggles, rather than the defining feature of his existence. Emma had grown confident and secure, able to trust in the permanence of their relationship and the stability of their home. She had learned that there were adults in the world who could be counted on to keep their promises and to put her needs first. More than that, she had learned that she was worthy of love and care, that her presence in someone's life was a gift rather than a burden. As they walked home through the warm summer evening, Emma slipped her small hand into Jack's weathered one. She looked up at him with eyes that now held hope instead of fear and told him she loved him. Jack's response was immediate and heartfelt. He loved her too, more than he had ever thought possible. The cowboy who had discovered a dying girl on a frozen park bench had found his purpose and his family in that moment of crisis. The pain that had once stabbed his chest with every breath had transformed into something else entirely. The sweet ache of love and responsibility that comes with caring for another person more than yourself. Their story had begun with desperate need and had evolved into something beautiful and permanent. Jack Morrison was no longer a broken-down cowboy waiting for his life to end. He was a father, a protector, and a man with a future full of possibilities. Emma Morrison was no longer a frightened child facing the world alone. She was a daughter, a student, and a young girl with dreams that stretched as wide as the Montana sky they would soon explore together. The healing that had taken place in both their lives was complete not because their problems had disappeared, but because they had learned to face their challenges together. They had discovered that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from overcoming our pain, but from finding purpose in protecting others from experiencing the same kind of suffering we have endured. As they settled into their home that night, both of them knew they had found something precious and rare, a family built on choice rather than chance, strengthened by adversity rather than weakened by it, and bound together by love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings.